A wife forced into bankruptcy court by her husband and his family finally reaches her breaking point as the judge calls the proceedings to order, but the tears streaming down her face aren't from the defeat everyone assumes. They're from the effort of maintaining this charade when she could end it with a single phone call to the attorneys managing the trillion-dollar real estate empire she inherited from a grandfather she barely knew. The husband and his family have orchestrated this bankruptcy with surgical precision, systematically freezing her accounts, destroying her credit, and isolating her from every resource. Yet they've made one catastrophic error. They never investigated the small company she listed on her asset disclosure, dismissing it as just another failed venture in a series of business mistakes. The judge begins reviewing the documents with mechanical efficiency, but when his eyes land on that company name, his hand stops moving and the color drains from his weathered face because he recognizes it. Everyone in high finance recognizes it as the holding entity that controls more commercial real estate than the next 10 competitors combined. What her husband and his family have done isn't just cruel but spectacularly stupid, dragging into court the one person who could destroy them without breaking a sweat. Yet they sit there radiating smug satisfaction while the judge struggles to maintain his composure. The recognition creates an electric moment where the power dynamics in the courtroom have completely inverted, but only two people know it. And the questions that matter now aren't about bankruptcy, but about what she'll do after the judge recognizes her company's name, how she'll dismantle the husband and family piece by piece, and whether the shock that's coming will teach them that forcing someone into court without knowing who they really are can be the last mistake they ever make. The courtroom smelled of old wood and broken dreams, but for Jennifer Martinez, it smelled like the final act of a performance she'd been rehearsing for 3 months. She sat at the defendant's table with her shoulders hunched forward, wearing a dress she'd purchased from a thrift store, specifically because it looked defeated. Yet beneath that carefully constructed exterior beat the heart of someone who'd spent 12 weeks documenting every illegal move her husband and his family had made. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that made everything feel surreal. But the surrealism of this moment had nothing to do with lighting and everything to do with the fact that she'd allowed herself to be pushed this far when she could have stopped it at any point. Her husband, Derek Martinez, sat 3 rows back with his mother, Patricia, and his sister, Caroline, flanking him like generals surveying a conquered battlefield. They'd dressed for victory, Derek in his most expensive suit, Patricia dripping with jewelry that Jennifer had always suspected was fake but had never cared enough to verify, and Caroline in a power dress that screamed corporate dominance despite the fact that she'd never held a real job in her life. The 3 of them had been whispering and pointing at Jennifer for the past 20 minutes, their voices low but their contempt palpable, yet none of them noticed the small smile that flickered across Jennifer's lips when she thought about what was coming. That smile disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but it had been there, and it represented 3 months of planning that were about to bear fruit in the most spectacular way imaginable. The judge, Honorable Raymond Foster, entered through his private door, and everyone stood with that automatic respect that courtrooms demand. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variety of human desperation, but what he hadn't seen, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was the case file sitting before him that would challenge everything he thought he understood about power and deception. Judge Foster settled into his chair with the efficient movements of someone who'd performed this ritual 10,000 times, but this would be the case he'd remember for the rest of his career, the one he'd tell his grandchildren about when they asked if his job was ever interesting. Case number 2024 BK 47893, Martinez versus Martinez, Judge Foster announced, his voice carrying that judicial authority that made even the innocent feel guilty. Petitioner Derek Martinez and supporting parties seeking bankruptcy declaration against respondent Jennifer Martinez. Jennifer felt Derek's eyes boring into the back of her head, and she knew without looking that he was smiling his predator smile, the one she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago before she'd realized it wasn't confidence but cruelty. The memory of their wedding day flashed through her mind. How handsome he'd looked, how his vows had sounded so sincere, how his family had welcomed her with open arms that turned out to be a trap closing around her future. But she pushed those thoughts away, because nostalgia was a luxury she couldn't afford in this moment. The woman she'd been on that wedding day had believed in fairy tales, but the woman sitting in this courtroom had learned that sometimes the dragon wins unless you become a dragon yourself. Derek's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Howard Chen, who charged $400 an hour to destroy people's lives, stood and approached the bench with his briefcase full of fabricated evidence and carefully constructed lies. Jennifer had her own attorney, a public defender named Michael Torres, who'd been assigned to her case and who had no idea he was representing someone who could buy the entire courthouse with pocket change. Yet Michael had been surprisingly competent despite his limited resources. He'd filed every motion she'd requested, documented every irregularity, and created a paper trail that would matter immensely in approximately 15 minutes when this entire proceeding exploded like a bomb in Derek's face. "Your Honor," Howard began, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey but just as poisonous. "My client Derek Martinez has exhausted every reasonable option to resolve his wife's financial irresponsibility. Over the past 18 months, Mrs. Martinez has accumulated over $300,000 in debt through failed business ventures, impulsive purchases, and a consistent pattern of fiscal mismanagement that has brought the entire family to the brink of ruin." The words hung in the air like accusations at a witch trial, but Jennifer didn't flinch because every syllable was a lie she could disprove with documentation. The debt Howard referenced had been manufactured through accounts Derek had opened in her name, credit cards he'd maxed out using her information, and business loans he'd taken using forged signatures that Jennifer had known about from the beginning but had allowed to continue. Some might call that strategy reckless, but Jennifer called it gathering ammunition, and she'd spent 3 months making sure every single fraudulent transaction was documented, time-stamped, and backed up on 7 different servers, including one in a country with no extradition treaty. The memory of how this had all started flooded back with painful clarity. It had been a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way, except for the certified letter that arrived with a return address she didn't recognize. Jennifer had been making coffee, still in her pajamas, when Derek had snatched the envelope from her hands. With a possessiveness that should have been her first warning, he'd opened it in front of her, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and then something darker that she'd never seen before. And when he'd finally looked up, his eyes held the kind of calculation that predicted violence. The letter had been from an estate attorney informing Jennifer that her maternal grandfather, Robert Castellano, had passed away and named her as the primary beneficiary of his estate. But what the letter hadn't specified, what Derek couldn't have known, was that Robert Castellano wasn't just wealthy but obscenely, generationally, change-the-world wealthy. Jennifer had never met her grandfather. Her mother, Catherine, had been estranged from him since before Jennifer was born, the result of some family conflict that Catherine had refused to discuss even on her deathbed 5 years ago. All Jennifer had known was that her grandfather existed somewhere on the East Coast, controlled some kind of real estate business, and wanted nothing to do with his daughter or granddaughter, yet apparently that had changed in his final years. The letter had instructed Jennifer to contact the law firm of Westbrook, Sterling and Associates within 30 days to begin the inheritance process, but Derek had immediately insisted they ignore it, claiming it was probably a scam and not worth pursuing. His insistence had been the second warning sign Jennifer had missed, or rather had chosen to ignore because she'd still believed her husband loved her, but Derek hadn't let it go. Over the following weeks, he'd become obsessed with that letter, alternating between dismissing it as fraud and interrogating Jennifer about her grandfather's wealth. His questions had grown increasingly aggressive. How much was the estate worth? Why had her mother never mentioned it? What kind of real estate business? Who else was in the will? Until finally Jennifer had agreed to contact the attorneys just to stop the constant pressure. That phone call had changed everything, but not in ways Derek could have anticipated, because the attorneys had insisted on meeting with Jennifer alone, without her husband, and had made her sign 17 different confidentiality agreements before revealing the truth about what she'd inherited. The truth was staggering. Robert Castellano hadn't just controlled a real estate business, but the real estate business, Castellano Global Holdings, a trillion-dollar empire that owned commercial properties in 63 countries, residential developments that housed millions of people, and enough raw land to qualify as the 23rd largest country on Earth if you measured by square miles. The attorneys had shown Jennifer spreadsheets that made her head spin, property portfolios that read like a geography textbook, and financial statements where the commas and zeros seemed to never end. Yet the most shocking revelation had been that her grandfather had been watching her for years. He'd known about her marriage to Derek, her struggles with her small graphic design business, and her genuine kindness that apparently reminded him of his late wife. Yet he'd maintained his distance because he was testing her character in ways that only the ultra-wealthy understood. The inheritance had come with conditions, naturally, because people with that much money never gave it away without strings attached. Jennifer had to maintain absolute confidentiality about her new wealth for a minimum of 6 months, allowing the estate attorneys to restructure ownership and protect assets from sudden gold diggers and fraudulent claims. She had to personally manage at least 3 major property acquisitions to prove she understood the business, yet she could delegate the actual work to the existing management team. Most importantly, she had to keep the money completely separate from her marriage, maintaining it in trust structures that Derek could never access because Robert Castellano's final instructions had been explicit. If my granddaughter's husband loves her for herself, this wealth will be a blessing, but if he loves her for potential fortune, this wealth will reveal his true character. Those words had proven prophetic with terrifying speed. Jennifer had returned home from that meeting with the attorneys, her head spinning from revelations about offshore accounts and international holdings. Yet she'd told Derek nothing because the confidentiality agreements carried penalties that could strip her of the entire inheritance. She'd simply said the estate was modest, mostly illiquid assets that would take years to settle, and Derek had seemed disappointed but accepting for about 48 hours. Then the accounts had started being frozen. Judge Foster's voice cut through Jennifer's memories. "Mr. Chen, please present your evidence of the defendant's financial irresponsibility." Howard Chen moved with practiced efficiency, distributing folders to the judge and to Michael Torres, while Derek and his family leaned forward with barely concealed eagerness. Jennifer watched Michael flip through the documents, his face showing appropriate concern at the debt statements and credit reports. Yet she'd already reviewed every page and knew exactly which documents were legitimate and which were forgeries. The forgeries were actually quite good. Derek had paid someone skilled to create them, but they had small inconsistencies that a forensic accountant would catch in minutes, and Jennifer had already hired the best forensic accountant in the country to prepare the counterattack. "Your Honor, you'll see from Exhibit A that Mrs. Martinez opened 7 credit cards in the past year alone," Howard said, pointing to highlighted sections with the confidence of someone who believed he held winning cards. Exhibit B shows purchases totaling over $160,000 at luxury retailers, vacation resorts, and high-end restaurants. Exhibit C documents 3 failed business ventures that lost approximately $90,000 in investment capital. Each exhibit was a masterpiece of deception, but what made it particularly cruel was that some of it was based on truth. Jennifer had started 3 small businesses in the past 2 years, a graphic design studio, an online boutique, and a consulting firm, but they hadn't failed so much as been systematically sabotaged. Derek had convinced her to put his name on the business accounts for tax purposes, then had withdrawn funds and blamed her for mismanagement, yet Jennifer had copies of every withdrawal with timestamps that proved he'd been the one draining the accounts. The luxury purchases were real, but they'd been Derek's, bought with credit cards he'd opened using her information after stealing her identity documents from their home safe. The identity theft had been discovered by accident 3 months ago when Jennifer had received a call from a credit monitoring service about suspicious activity. She'd initially assumed it was a scam call, but something had made her investigate, and what she'd found had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Derek hadn't just stolen her identity, he'd done it with military precision, creating a paper trail that made her look financially incompetent, while he positioned himself as the responsible spouse trying to clean up her mess. He'd been planning this bankruptcy for months, setting her up to be declared insolvent so he could take control of any assets she might have, including whatever he imagined she might inherit from her grandfather's estate. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but what Derek hadn't known was that Jennifer had been documenting everything. The estate attorneys had connected her with a private investigation firm that specialized in financial crimes, and over 3 months, they'd traced every forged signature, every fraudulent account, and every illegal transaction back to Derek. More importantly, they'd discovered that Patricia and Caroline had been active participants in the scheme, providing Derek with advice, helping him forge documents, and even contributing their own money to hire Howard Chen. The entire family had conspired to bankrupt Jennifer, believing she was vulnerable and alone, yet they'd actually been creating the evidence that would destroy them. Michael Torres stood, and Jennifer felt a surge of gratitude for this overworked public defender who'd taken her case seriously despite having 100 other files on his desk. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a 15-minute recess to review these documents and prepare a response." Judge Foster nodded. "Granted, we'll reconvene at 10:45. He stood, and everyone rose as he exited through his private door. The moment the judge disappeared, Derek's family erupted in barely suppressed celebration. Caroline laughed loudly, Patricia pulled out her phone to text someone, and Derek himself turned to stare at Jennifer with undisguised triumph. He mouthed something. It looked like "it's over," and Jennifer had to fight the urge to respond, to tell him that he was right, but not in the way he thought. Instead, she kept her head down, maintaining the broken posture she'd perfected over 3 months, yet inside she was counting down the minutes until the explosion. Michael approached her table. "Jennifer, these documents are damaging, but I think we can argue procedural irregularities in how they were obtained. I'll need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything in your financial history that you haven't told me about?" This was the moment Jennifer had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The confidentiality period had actually ended 2 weeks ago, but she'd maintained the silence because revealing her wealth too early would have allowed Derek to adjust his strategy. Now, with his case fully presented and his lies locked into the court record, it was time to drop the bomb. Jennifer looked at Michael, this dedicated public servant who'd fought for her, despite believing she was just another struggling woman being destroyed by a vindictive spouse, and felt genuine affection for his integrity. "Michael," she said quietly, making sure her voice didn't carry to Derek's side of the courtroom, "there's something I need to tell you, but you're going to need to sit down first." Michael's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "What do you mean?" Jennifer pulled a folder from her bag, not the worn canvas bag she'd been carrying to court, but a discreet leather portfolio she'd kept hidden until this moment. Inside were documents that Michael had never seen. Trust agreements, property deeds, corporate ownership structures, and financial statements that had more zeros than he'd probably seen in his entire career. She handed them to him without a word, watching his face carefully as he began to read. The transformation was remarkable. Michael's eyes widened, his mouth fell open, and the color drained from his face in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. He flipped through page after page, his hands starting to shake slightly, and Jennifer could almost see the calculations running through his mind as he processed what he was reading. When he finally looked up at her, his expression had shifted from confusion to something close to awe mixed with anger. "You've been sitting here for 3 months, letting me represent you as an indigent client," he whispered harshly, "when you could buy this entire city block." "I needed Derek to commit completely to his fraud," Jennifer replied, her voice still quiet but no longer carrying that defeated tone. "If I'd revealed this earlier, he would have backed off, claimed it was a misunderstanding, and walked away with maybe a slap on the wrist. But now he's committed perjury, submitted fraudulent documents, and orchestrated identity theft. All of it documented and sworn to under oath. He's destroyed himself, Michael, and he doesn't even know it yet." Michael stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, he was. The broken woman he'd been defending had just transformed into a corporate titan, yet Jennifer could see him processing the implications, understanding why she'd played this role, and grudgingly accepting that her strategy had been brilliant, even if it had made him look foolish. He glanced back at the documents, then at Derek and his family, who were still celebrating their apparent victory, and a smile slowly spread across his face. "You're about to destroy them," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm about to let them destroy themselves," Jennifer corrected. "There's a difference." The 15-minute recess stretched to 20 as Michael absorbed the information and adjusted his strategy. Jennifer watched the courtroom clock tick forward, each second bringing them closer to the moment when everything would change. She thought about the past 7 years with Derek, trying to pinpoint when his love had turned to calculation, but she suspected it had always been calculation disguised as love. He'd pursued her aggressively when they'd first met at a business networking event, sweeping her off her feet with romantic gestures and passionate declarations. Yet in hindsight, every gesture had been calibrated to create dependence. The memory of their first date came back with painful clarity. Derek had taken her to an expensive restaurant she couldn't afford, ordered for both of them without asking her preference, and spent the entire evening talking about his family's construction business and how successful he was going to be. Jennifer had been charmed by his confidence, interpreting his dominance as strength, yet now she recognized it as the first move in a long campaign to make her feel inferior. He'd slowly isolated her from her friends, criticizing them as bad influences who didn't understand her potential. He'd convinced her to quit her stable corporate job to start her own business, promising to support her but then constantly undermining her confidence. He'd moved them into a house his mother owned, making Jennifer feel like a guest in her own home while creating financial dependence that made leaving nearly impossible. The manipulation had been masterful, but it had also been Derek's fatal mistake. By pushing Jennifer to start her own business, he'd inadvertently given her the corporate structure she'd needed to inherit her grandfather's empire. Castellano Global Holdings had been folded into Jennifer's existing LLC through a complex legal restructuring that made the company look like a small graphic design firm, while actually controlling assets worth more than most nations' GDP. The attorneys had been surprised by how perfectly Jennifer's existing business structure had facilitated the transfer, but Jennifer had known it was her grandfather's final gift. He'd been watching, waiting, and setting up the pieces so she'd be ready when the time came. Judge Foster returned at 10:53, 8 minutes late, but carrying an energy that suggested he'd used the recess to handle an urgent matter. He settled into his chair and gestured for everyone to sit, his eyes scanning the courtroom with that practiced judicial assessment that missed nothing. Jennifer felt his gaze linger on her for a moment longer than necessary, and she wondered if he sensed that something was about to change. "Mr. Chen, do you have additional evidence to present?" Judge Foster asked. Howard stood, straightening his tie with the self-satisfaction of someone who believed victory was assured. "No, Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Mrs. Martinez has demonstrated a clear pattern of financial irresponsibility that has brought irreparable harm to my client and his family. We're requesting that the court declare her bankrupt, appoint a trustee to manage her affairs, and allow Mr. Martinez to assume control of any community property or future assets to prevent further damage." The request was more aggressive than Jennifer had anticipated, but it also made perfect sense given Derek's endgame. He wasn't just trying to punish her, he was trying to position himself to claim the inheritance he believed was coming from her grandfather's estate. If the court appointed him as trustee of her affairs, he could potentially argue that the inheritance was community property acquired during their marriage, giving him access to wealth he'd never earned. It was a bold strategy that might have worked if Jennifer had actually been the vulnerable, financially incompetent woman Derek believed her to be. Judge Foster turned to Michael. "Mr. Torres, does your client wish to respond?" Michael stood, and Jennifer could see he was enjoying this moment. "Your Honor, my client absolutely wishes to respond, but first I'd like to submit evidence that was recently brought to my attention. I apologize for the late disclosure, but the circumstances are extraordinary." He handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Foster. Jennifer watched the judge's face carefully as he opened the folder and began reading the documents inside. The first few pages were straightforward. Forensic accounting reports showing that the debt attributed to Jennifer had actually been manufactured by Derek. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to concerned as he read the evidence of identity theft, forged signatures, and fraudulent accounts. But Jennifer knew the real shock was coming on page 17, where the trust agreements and corporate ownership documents revealed exactly who she was. The moment happened in slow motion. Judge Foster turned to page 17, and his entire body went rigid. His eyes widened, his face drained of color, and his hand stopped moving as if he'd been frozen in time. Jennifer watched him read that page 3 times, his eyes tracking back and forth across the corporate name that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than what it was: Castellano Global Holdings, with Jennifer Martinez listed as majority owner and principal director. The recognition that flooded his face was everything Jennifer had been waiting for, because Judge Foster wasn't just any judge. He'd spent 15 years as a corporate attorney before joining the bench, specializing in real estate law, and there wasn't a person in that field who didn't know the name Castellano. The silence in the courtroom stretched like taffy, becoming uncomfortable and then unbearable. Derek and his family had stopped their whispering, sensing that something had shifted, even if they couldn't identify what. Howard Chen looked confused, glancing between the judge and the documents with growing concern. Michael Torres stood, perfectly still, letting the moment build, understanding that sometimes the most powerful advocacy was simply letting truth speak for itself. Judge Foster slowly raised his eyes from the documents and looked directly at Jennifer. His expression was complex, shock, mixed with respect, mixed with something that might have been anger at having been made part of this elaborate performance. Jennifer met his gaze steadily, no longer maintaining the broken posture she'd worn for 3 months, and in that moment of eye contact, an entire conversation happened without words. The judge was asking if this was real, and Jennifer's steady gaze was confirming that it was. He was asking why she'd allowed it to go this far, and her slight nod toward Derek and his family was explaining the strategy. He was asking what happened next, and her raised eyebrow was inviting him to do his job. "Mr. Chen," Judge Foster said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge that made the attorney straighten nervously, "did you or your client perform any investigation into Mrs. Martinez's actual financial holdings before filing this bankruptcy petition?" The question landed like a grenade in the middle of the courtroom. Howard Chen's confident expression cracked, and Jennifer saw the first flicker of doubt cross his features. "Your Honor, we conducted thorough due diligence based on the information available. Mrs. Martinez's disclosed assets appeared to be minimal, consisting primarily of a small business entity that our research indicated was essentially worthless." "What was the name of that business entity?" Judge Foster asked, and Jennifer recognized the tone. He was giving Howard one last chance to realize what he'd missed. Howard consulted his notes. Castellano Creative Solutions, LLC, a small graphic design firm that appeared to have minimal revenue and significant debt. "And you didn't investigate the ownership structure of that LLC?" Judge Foster pressed. "You didn't look into whether it might be a subsidiary or holding company for larger assets?" The color was starting to drain from Howard's face as he realized he'd made a catastrophic error. "Your Honor, the name suggested it was a small creative business. We had no reason to believe—" "The name," Judge Foster interrupted, "is Castellano, as in Robert Castellano, as in Castellano Global Holdings, which I'm sure you're aware is one of the largest real estate empires in the world." The courtroom erupted. Derek shot to his feet, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Patricia gasped loudly, her phone clattering to the floor. Caroline's mouth fell open in a perfect O of shock. Howard Chen looked like he might be sick, his expensive suit suddenly seeming shabby as he realized he'd just tried to bankrupt a woman who could buy his law firm as a rounding error. Michael Torres fought to keep a neutral expression, but Jennifer could see the satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Your Honor," Derek called out, his voice cracking, "there must be some mistake. My wife doesn't have any connection to Castellano Global Holdings. She's never even mentioned." "Mr. Martinez," Judge Foster's voice cracked like a whip, "you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Derek collapsed back into his seat, but his eyes were locked on Jennifer with an expression she'd never seen before. It was beyond shock, beyond fear. It was the look of someone watching their entire world collapse. Patricia was frantically scrolling through her phone, presumably looking up Castellano Global Holdings and realizing the magnitude of what they'd done. Caroline had gone completely pale, her power dress suddenly looking like a costume on a child playing dress-up. Judge Foster returned his attention to the documents, reading through the forensic accounting reports with increasing anger. Jennifer watched him process the evidence of Derek's fraud, the systematic identity theft, the forged documents, and the manufactured debt. Each page seemed to make him angrier, and Jennifer understood why. She'd forced him to be part of this performance, to play the role of impartial arbiter while she'd been orchestrating a trap for her husband. Judges didn't like being used, even when the cause was just, yet she'd calculated that his respect for legal procedure would outweigh his personal irritation. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Foster said, his voice now formal and cold, "would you please approach the bench?" Jennifer stood, and the movement felt different than every other time she'd stood in this courtroom. She wasn't hunched anymore, wasn't projecting defeat, wasn't playing the role of victim. She walked to the bench with her shoulders back and her head high, and she could feel Derek's eyes burning into her back as he finally understood how completely he'd been deceived. When she reached the bench, Judge Foster leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only she and Michael could hear. "You've made this courtroom part of your revenge play," he said quietly, "and I should hold you in contempt for wasting the court's time." With respect, Your Honor, Jennifer replied, her voice steady, I haven't wasted anything. My husband committed multiple felonies by manufacturing this bankruptcy case. He forged my signature on financial documents, opened fraudulent accounts in my name, and conspired with his family to steal my identity and destroy my credit. If I'd revealed my wealth earlier, he would have backed away and claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But now he's committed those crimes in your courtroom, under oath, with witnesses and documentation. I haven't wasted the court's time. I've given you a gift-wrapped criminal case. Judge Foster stared at her for a long moment, and Jennifer couldn't read his expression. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward in what might have been the ghost of a smile. You're either brilliant or dangerous, Mrs. Martinez, and I'm not sure which concerns me more. Why not both? Jennifer replied, and this time she did smile. The judge leaned back in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice carried throughout the courtroom. I'm going to read into the record what I've just discovered, and then we're going to have a very different conversation than the one Mr. Chen anticipated. He held up the ownership documents. Mrs. Jennifer Martinez is not bankrupt. In fact, Mrs. Martinez is the majority owner of Castellano Creative Solutions, LLC, which despite its innocuous name is actually the primary holding company for Castellano Global Holdings, a real estate empire valued at approximately $1.3 trillion, with assets in 63 countries, including 17 office towers in Manhattan alone. The failed business ventures Mr. Chen referenced in his filings are actually wildly successful property management subsidiaries that generated approximately $47 billion in revenue last year. The numbers hit Derek like physical blows. Jennifer watched him slump in his seat, his face going from red to white to green. Patricia looked like she might faint, gripping the bench in front of her with white-knuckled hands. Caroline was crying, tears streaming down her face as she realized the implications of what they'd done. Howard Chen had his phone out, frantically scrolling, and Jennifer knew he was looking at Castellano Global Holdings' website, reading about the empire he'd tried to bankrupt, understanding that his career was probably over, but Judge Foster wasn't finished. What's more troubling is the evidence Mr. Torres has submitted, showing that the debt attributed to Mrs. Martinez was largely manufactured through identity theft and fraud perpetrated by her husband, Derek Martinez, with apparent assistance from his mother, Patricia Martinez, and his sister, Caroline Martinez. The forensic accounting report details 17 separate instances of forged signatures, 9 fraudulent credit accounts opened using Mrs. Martinez's stolen information, and systematic withdrawals from business accounts that Mr. Derek Martinez had convinced his wife to give him access to. Derek tried to stand, tried to protest, but no words came out. He looked like a man drowning, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Jennifer felt a surge of emotion watching him, not satisfaction exactly, but something closer to relief. For 3 months, she'd played the victim, had allowed herself to be pushed around and humiliated, had endured his family's contempt and his attorney's accusations, all for this moment. She'd let Derek believe he was winning so he would commit completely to his fraud, and now she had him. Mr. Chen, Judge Foster continued, his voice sharp with judicial authority, I'm denying your petition for bankruptcy and referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. The evidence suggests your client and his family have committed multiple felonies, including identity theft, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. I'm also issuing a temporary restraining order, preventing Mr. Derek Martinez from having any contact with his wife, and freezing all assets in his name pending the criminal investigation. Howard Chen's face had gone completely pale. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of any fraudulent activity. I relied on information provided by my client, which is why you're not being referred for criminal charges, Judge Foster interrupted. though I suspect the state bar will be very interested in your failure to perform adequate due diligence before filing a bankruptcy petition against a trillion-dollar corporation." The words trillion-dollar corporation seemed to echo in the stunned silence of the courtroom. Jennifer turned to look at Derek and his family, and what she saw on their faces was everything she'd been waiting for, complete devastation mixed with dawning understanding of how thoroughly they'd been outplayed. Derek was staring at her like she was a stranger, which in a way she was, because the woman he'd married had been genuine but naive. The woman standing before him now had been forged through his betrayal, and she was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Patricia found her voice first. "Jennifer, sweetheart, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Derek was only trying to help you manage your finances. We all were. We're family." "We're not family," Jennifer said quietly, but her voice cut through Patricia's pleading like a knife. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't forge signatures and destroy credit. Family doesn't drag someone to bankruptcy court to humiliate them. You stopped being my family the moment Derek opened that first fraudulent account in my name." "But we didn't know," Caroline wailed. "We didn't know you were rich. If you'd known, you would have been nicer while you were robbing me," Jennifer finished. "That doesn't make it better, Caroline. That makes it worse. You destroyed me when you thought I was vulnerable and powerless. The fact that I turned out to be neither doesn't change what you did. It just means you were wrong about who you were dealing with." Judge Foster banged his gavel. "Mrs. Martinez, while I appreciate your candor, I'll ask you to refrain from addressing the other parties directly. Mr. Torres, does your client wish to file any counterclaims?" Michael Torres was grinning openly now, no longer bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Your Honor, my client will be filing a civil lawsuit against Derek, Patricia, and Caroline Martinez for fraud, identity theft, emotional distress, and conspiracy. We'll also be seeking full prosecution of the criminal charges. Additionally, Mrs. Martinez will be filing for divorce on grounds of fraud and seeking a full investigation into all community assets to ensure none of her wealth was illegally transferred during the marriage." Derek finally found his voice. "Jennifer, please, let's talk about this. I made mistakes, but we can work through this. 7 years of marriage has to count for something." Jennifer looked at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and felt a strange mixture of pity and contempt. "You're right, Derek. 7 years should count for something. It counts as 7 years of evidence documenting your systematic manipulation and financial abuse. It counts as 7 years of you slowly destroying my confidence while pretending to support me. It counts as 7 years of you seeing me as a target rather than a partner. So yes, it counts for something. It counts as exactly the amount of time it took for you to reveal who you really are." The truth of those words hung in the courtroom like smoke. Derek's face crumpled, and for a moment Jennifer almost felt sorry for him, but then she remembered the frozen accounts, the destroyed credit, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep while he'd celebrated with his family, and her sympathy evaporated. He'd made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. Judge Foster gathered his documents. "I'm adjourning these proceedings pending criminal investigation. Mrs. Martinez, you're free to go. Mr. Martinez, you're ordered to remain in the jurisdiction and surrender your passport to the court within 24 hours. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to seal Derek's fate. The bailiff moved to escort Derek and his family out, but before they left, Derek turned back to look at Jennifer one more time. His expression was complex. Betrayal mixed with realization, mixed with something that might have been respect if it weren't buried under so much shock. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "About the inheritance." Jennifer could have lied, could have let him believe she'd only recently discovered her wealth, but she decided he deserved to know the truth. 3 months, since the week after I met with the estate attorneys. I've known for 3 months exactly what you were doing, and I let you do it because I needed you to commit fully to your fraud." "You used me," Derek said, and there was wonder in his voice along with horror. "No," Jennifer corrected. "You used me or tried to. I simply gave you enough rope to hang yourself. There's a difference." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but the bailiff was already moving him toward the exit. Patricia was sobbing loudly now, and Caroline looked completely shell-shocked. Howard Chen had already disappeared, probably to call his malpractice insurance carrier. In moments, the courtroom had emptied except for Jennifer, Michael, and Judge Foster, who was still sitting at his bench, watching her with an expression that mixed respect and wariness. "Mrs. Martinez," the judge said quietly, "what you did today was legal, but it was also manipulative on a scale I've rarely seen. You allowed this case to proceed, knowing you could stop it at any time just so you could maximize the criminal exposure of your husband and his family." "Yes," Jennifer agreed, seeing no point in denying it. "That concerns me," Judge Foster continued, "because it suggests a level of strategic thinking and willingness to manipulate systems that could be dangerous if directed at less deserving targets." Jennifer considered his words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand your concern, but I'd ask you to consider the alternative. If I'd revealed my wealth immediately, Derek would have backed away, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, and probably gotten away with a slap on the wrist. He would have learned that he could manipulate and abuse people as long as he didn't get caught. Instead, he's learned that actions have consequences, and his mother and sister have learned the same lesson. I didn't create this situation. I just made sure the people responsible couldn't escape accountability." Judge Foster studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose there's wisdom in that, even if the execution makes me uncomfortable. I hope you'll use your obvious intelligence and wealth responsibly, Mrs. Martinez." "I intend to, Your Honor," Jennifer replied, and she meant it. As she left the courthouse with Michael Torres beside her, Jennifer felt the weight of 3 months lifting from her shoulders. The performance was over. The trap had been sprung, and she was finally free to be herself again. The sunlight outside felt brighter than it had in months, and the air tasted sweeter. "So what happens now?" Michael asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. Jennifer pulled out her phone and opened it to reveal a text message thread with 7 different attorneys, each specializing in a different aspect of the legal assault she was about to unleash. "Now I dismantle Derek's life the way he tried to dismantle mine, but I do it legally and thoroughly. His construction business was built on loans guaranteed by his family's reputation. I'm buying those loans and calling them due. His mother's house, the one he moved us into, was purchased with a mortgage she can barely afford. I'm buying that mortgage too. His sister's corporate job exists because Derek knew her boss. I'm acquiring that company, and the first thing I'll do is fire Caroline for cause." Michael's eyes widened. "That's comprehensive." "That's justice," Jennifer corrected. "Derek believed he could destroy me without consequences because he thought I was powerless. I'm teaching him that power isn't about money, it's about knowing when to use it. The money just makes the lesson more expensive." She started walking down the courthouse steps, and Michael hurried to keep up. "What about you? What's next for Jennifer Martinez, billionaire CEO?" Jennifer smiled, and it was genuine for the first time in months. "First, I'm finalizing the divorce and making absolutely sure Derek doesn't see a penny of community property. Then I'm relocating to New York to take active control of Castellano Global Holdings. My grandfather left me an empire, but he also left me a responsibility to the millions of people who live and work in our properties. I'm going to honor that responsibility. And Derek? Derek will face criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. He'll probably serve time. His family will be financially ruined by the civil suits. And for the rest of his life, He'll be known as the man who tried to bankrupt a trillion-dollar empire because he was too lazy to do due diligence. That's not revenge. That's just the natural consequences of his choices catching up to him. They reached the street and a black car pulled up, Jennifer's driver, arranged by the estate attorneys months ago, but kept hidden until now. Michael stared at the expensive vehicle, then at Jennifer, and shook his head in amazement. "You know," he said, "I've been a public defender for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of people get screwed by the system. It's nice to see someone actually get justice for once, even if the method was unorthodox." Jennifer offered her hand. "Thank you for representing me, Michael. You did excellent work, even when you thought I was just another struggling client. That kind of integrity is rare." Michael shook her hand, then paused. "Can I ask you something? When you were sitting in that courtroom pretending to be defeated, playing that role for 3 months, was any of it real? Did it hurt?" Jennifer thought about the question, really considered it. Every moment of it was real. The tears were real. The fear was real. The humiliation was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the defeat. Because I knew something Derek didn't. I knew I had the power to end it whenever I wanted. But yes, Michael, it hurt. It hurt terribly. And that pain is part of why I'm going to make sure Derek faces every consequence he's earned. She climbed into the car, and as it pulled away from the courthouse, Jennifer looked back at the building where she'd spent 3 months playing victim. The performance had been exhausting and painful, but it had also been necessary. Derek had needed to believe he was winning so completely that he would commit fully to his fraud, creating evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Patricia and Caroline had needed to reveal their true characters, showing that their participation wasn't accidental but calculated. Howard Chen had needed to stake his professional reputation on a case built on lies and inadequate research. And now, they would all pay the price. Jennifer's phone buzzed with a message from the head of Castellano Global Holdings' legal department. Courthouse surveillance confirms all evidence gathered. Criminal referral filed with DA's office. Civil suits ready for filing. Mortgage acquisition proceeding on schedule. Loan call paperwork prepared. Corporate acquisition of sister's employer completed this morning. Termination paperwork ready for your signature. The efficiency was almost frightening, but it was also exactly what Robert Castellano had built this empire to do: protect its owners and execute their will with precision. Jennifer typed back, "Proceed with all actions. No mercy, but everything by the book. I want this to be a masterclass in how to legally destroy someone who deserves it." As the car wound through city traffic toward her hotel, she'd been staying in a modest chain location to maintain her cover, but tonight she'd moved to the penthouse suite her attorneys had been holding for her. Jennifer reflected on the bizarre journey that had led to this moment. 7 years ago, she'd been a naive young woman who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. She'd married Derek thinking she'd found her prince, not realizing he was the dragon in disguise. She'd endured years of subtle manipulation and control, slowly having her confidence eroded and her independence stripped away. But then her grandfather's inheritance had given her something Derek could never take away: options. Not just financial options, though those were certainly helpful, but the option to fight back, the option to refuse to be a victim, the option to turn the tables on her abuser. Robert Castellano had never met her, but his final gift had been the power to transform from prey to predator, and Jennifer had seized that opportunity with both hands. The truth was that the woman Derek had married wouldn't have been capable of what Jennifer had just done. That woman had been too trusting, too willing to see the best in people, too afraid of conflict. But Derek had systematically destroyed that woman over 7 years of marriage, and in doing so, he'd created something far more dangerous: a woman who understood how predators think because she'd been hunted by one. A woman who'd learned patience and strategy from months of being manipulated. a woman who'd discovered that the best revenge wasn't emotional satisfaction but cold, calculated justice. Her phone rang, and Jennifer smiled when she saw the caller ID. It was Maria Rodriguez, her grandfather's former chief financial officer, and now Jennifer's most trusted advisor. Maria had been managing Castellano Global Holdings for the past 3 months, while Jennifer played her role in the bankruptcy court, and they'd spoken nearly every day about strategy. "I'm watching the courthouse feed," Maria said without preamble. "How do you feel?" "Lighter," Jennifer admitted, "like I've been carrying a weight for 3 months and I finally get to put it down." "The media is already picking up the story," Maria continued. "A bankruptcy case involving Castellano Global Holdings is major news. Derek's name is going to be plastered everywhere as the man who tried to bankrupt his wife and discovered she was a secret billionaire. It's going to be quite the scandal." Jennifer had anticipated this. "Let it play out naturally. Don't issue any press releases. Don't make any statements. Let the facts speak for themselves. The public will figure out pretty quickly that Derek is the villain in this story." "What about you? Are you ready for the attention? You've been invisible for years, and now you're about to become one of the most famous women in America." It was a good question. Jennifer had spent her entire adult life in the shadows, first as Derek's controlled wife and then as the secret heir to a massive fortune. Now she was about to step into the spotlight as the head of a trillion-dollar empire, and that came with scrutiny she'd never experienced. But she'd been thinking about this for 3 months, preparing mentally for the exposure. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "I'm done hiding. Robert Castellano left me this empire because he believed I could handle it, and I'm going to prove him right. Let the world see who I am, the real me, not the broken woman Derek tried to create." "Spoken like a true Castellano," Maria said with approval. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the family name wasn't about money. It was about knowing when to fight and how to win. You've just demonstrated both." They discussed logistics for another 20 minutes. Jennifer would need to relocate to New York within the week. There were board meetings to attend and executives to meet, properties to visit and deals to review. The work of running a trillion-dollar empire was overwhelming, but Jennifer discovered she was excited rather than intimidated. This was what she'd been preparing for without knowing it. All those years building small businesses and learning how to manage operations. Derek had thought he was sabotaging her career, but he'd actually been training her for something far bigger. When the call ended, Jennifer's car was pulling up to her hotel. She looked at the modest chain location with its worn carpeting and fluorescent lighting and made a decision. She wasn't going to stay here another night. She wasn't going to maintain the fiction of being broke and defeated. That performance was over, and it was time to step into her real life. She called her attorney. "Book me a suite at the St. Regis, the best they have. I'm done pretending." "Already done," the attorney replied. "I took the liberty of moving your belongings an hour ago. I figured after today you'd be ready to stop hiding." Jennifer laughed, and it felt good. "You figured right. Send a car to pick me up in 30 minutes. She used those 30 minutes to shower and change, washing away the thrift store clothes and defeated posture she'd worn for 3 months. When she emerged, she was wearing a designer suit that had been tailored specifically for her, one of the first things she'd purchased with her inheritance, but had never worn because it didn't fit her character. Now it fit perfectly, not just physically but emotionally. She was Jennifer Martinez, CEO of Castellano Global Holdings, and she looked the part. The drive to the St. Regis took 20 minutes through evening traffic, and Jennifer used the time to check the news coverage of the bankruptcy hearing. The story was already trending on social media, with headlines like "Secret Billionaire Exposes Husband's Bankruptcy Fraud" and "Man Tries to Bankrupt Wife, Discovers She Owns Trillion-Dollar Empire." The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Jennifer, with people praising her strategic thinking and calling Derek every unflattering name imaginable. There was already a hashtag, trillion-dollar revenge, and people were sharing similar stories of financial abuse and manipulation. Jennifer realized her case was becoming more than just personal vindication. It was becoming a cultural moment, a story that resonated with everyone who'd ever been underestimated or abused. The responsibility of that made her pause, but it also strengthened her resolve. If her story could help others recognize financial abuse and fight back, then the 3 months of performance had been worth every difficult moment. The St. Regis was everything the chain hotel wasn't: elegant, refined, and expensive. The lobby dripped with old money sophistication, and the staff recognized Jennifer immediately, despite her having never been there before. Word had clearly spread about who she was, and she was treated like the royalty her bank account suggested. The suite was spectacular. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and more space than Jennifer had lived in during her entire marriage to Derek. She stood at those windows looking out at the city lights and thought about the future. Tomorrow she would start the process of taking active control of Castellano Global Holdings. She would meet with executives, review property portfolios, and begin making decisions that would affect millions of people. It was daunting but exhilarating, and for the first time in 7 years, Jennifer felt like herself. Not the person Derek wanted her to be, not the broken woman she'd pretended to be in court, but her authentic self with all the intelligence, strength, and capability she'd been forced to hide. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your victory. You've shown remarkable strategic thinking. If you're interested in discussing how Castellano Global Holdings might partner with our firm on some upcoming projects, I'd love to schedule a meeting. Amanda Chen, Goldman Sachs." Jennifer stared at the message, then started laughing. 24 hours ago, she couldn't get a return call from a community bank about a small business loan. Now Goldman Sachs was reaching out to pitch partnership opportunities. The shift was so dramatic it was almost comedic, yet it also proved everything she'd been thinking about: power and perception. Derek had believed she was powerless because she appeared financially struggling. The business world had ignored her because her company looked small and insignificant. But the moment her true wealth was revealed, everyone's perception shifted instantly. The lesson was clear. Power didn't come from having resources. It came from knowing when to reveal them. Jennifer had hidden her wealth for 3 months, endured abuse and manipulation, allowed herself to be pushed to the edge of bankruptcy, all so she could choose the perfect moment to reveal who she really was. That moment had been in Judge Foster's courtroom, with Derek and his family fully committed to their fraud, with all the evidence documented and witnessed, with no possible escape or explanation that could save them. And now they would pay for underestimating her. Jennifer's phone rang again. This time it was the district attorney's office, calling to schedule an interview about pressing criminal charges against Derek. She answered and spent 45 minutes walking them through the evidence, the timeline, and the extent of Derek's fraud. The prosecutor sounded almost eager, and Jennifer understood why. This was a high-profile case that would generate significant media attention, and prosecuting Derek would be seen as standing up for victims of financial abuse. When that call ended, Jennifer ordered room service, not because she was particularly hungry, but because she could, because it was a luxury Derek would have criticized as wasteful, because it was a small assertion of freedom. While she waited for the food to arrive, she drafted an email to the board of directors at Castellano Global Holdings, introducing herself formally and outlining her vision for the company's future. Her grandfather had been conservative in his investments, focusing on stable, long-term holdings, but Jennifer wanted to be more aggressive, developing affordable housing projects, investing in sustainable building technologies, and using the company's massive resources to address urban housing crises. The email took an hour to write, and when she was finished, Jennifer felt satisfied with it. She wasn't trying to be her grandfather, she was trying to be herself, bringing her own values and vision to the empire he'd built. The board might resist, might prefer the status quo, but Jennifer had controlling interest and the legal authority to implement her vision. They would adapt or be replaced. Room service arrived, a perfectly cooked steak, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Jennifer used to spend on groceries in a month. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, thinking about how different this moment was from the countless dinners she'd shared with Derek, where every bite had been seasoned with tension and criticism. He'd constantly monitored what she ate, making comments about her weight or her choices, using food as another mechanism of control. Now she could eat what she wanted, when she wanted, without judgment or commentary, and that simple freedom felt profound. As she finished dinner, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Derek Martinez arrested on identity theft and fraud charges. Jennifer clicked through to the article and read that Derek had been taken into custody at his mother's house, where he'd apparently been drinking heavily since leaving the courthouse. The article included his mugshot. He looked haggard and destroyed, nothing like the confident man who'd walked into court that morning expecting victory. Patricia and Caroline had also been arrested on conspiracy charges, and the article noted that all three were being held on substantial bail. Jennifer felt a complicated mixture of emotions looking at Derek's mugshot. Part of her felt satisfaction at seeing him face consequences. Part of her felt sadness at the waste of what could have been a good marriage if Derek had been a different person. But mostly she felt relief that this chapter of her life was finally closing. Derek would face trial, would probably be convicted, would spend time in prison. His mother and sister would be financially ruined by legal fees and civil judgments, and Jennifer would move forward with her life, building something meaningful with the resources her grandfather had left her. She closed the news article and opened her calendar, looking at the week ahead. Monday, she had meetings with the Castellano Global Holdings executive team. Tuesday was a press conference where she would formally introduce herself as the company's new CEO. Wednesday through Friday were property visits to major holdings in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The schedule was packed, demanding, and exactly what she needed to move forward. Jennifer's last thought before falling asleep in the absurdly comfortable hotel bed was about her grandfather, Robert Castellano, whom she'd never met, but who had somehow understood her better than anyone else. He'd watched her from a distance, seen her struggle in a bad marriage, recognized her genuine kindness and intelligence, and decided she deserved the chance to transform her life. His inheritance hadn't just been money. It had been opportunity, power, and the tools to fight back against those who'd tried to destroy her. She silently thanked him, wherever he was, for believing in her when she'd barely believed in herself, and she promised that she would honor his legacy, not by simply maintaining what he'd built, but by making it better, using the empire for good, and proving that power wielded with wisdom could change lives. The city lights glittered outside her window, and somewhere in that city, Derek was sitting in a jail cell, contemplating the catastrophic series of choices that had led him there. He'd married Jennifer believing he'd found an easy target, someone he could control and manipulate. He'd underestimated her intelligence, her resilience, and her capacity for strategic thinking. And when he'd finally pushed her too far, when he'd forced her into bankruptcy court, thinking it would be his final victory, he'd actually engineered his own destruction, because the wife forced into bankruptcy court by her husband and his family had inherited a $1 trillion real estate empire, and what she did after the judge recognized her company's name had shocked them all. But it was exactly what they deserved.